Okay, guys, let's talk about factors that actually affect natural selection. And so remember, natural selection, when we're speaking about this, really we need two things to happen. We need variation within my population, and then I need a change in the environment. Because if my environment never changes, the natural selection isn't going to take place. But for natural selection to take place with a change in the environment, you have to have variation with your population. But there's other things that can also affect natural selection, and one of those being genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is a loss of genetic diversity because of allele frequency. Okay? And so what that means is, like, by dominant genes. So if you had organisms and they had a dominant gene, then if that's all you introduced to that population, then they're all going to show the dominant trait. So genetic drift is when you lose genetic diversity because of an allele frequency. All right, so now my next thing is the bottleneck effect. Now, the bottleneck effect is when you have a large population and it drastically reduces due to some type of event. Okay, and so right here you have, see, I haven't drew a bottle. You have a population inside your bottle. You have yellow and green and red and blue variations within the population. But then an event took place, like maybe a natural disaster, a flood, or maybe human involvement took place. We cut down a forest, or we plowed a field. Because of that, we did have a large population, but now it's super tiny, okay? But this super tiny population is way less diverse, because I had 4 different colors up here in the bottle, but now I only have 2 colors, and out of those 2 colors, I only have 5 organisms versus all the ones that were in the bottle. So bottleneck effect is when I lose genetic diversity because my population went from large to small because of an event. Okay, now next idea. Now we have the founder effect. The founder effect is the same idea. I go from a large population to a small one right here, but it's not because of an event. It's because of, I'm going to colonize a new area. So if we pretend that this was an island over here, and this island had the green, the blue, and the yellow, and the red or varieties, right? Variations within my population, but a few of those, flew, or they left and they went to a new area. So like now I only have yellow and green, and I have far less organisms than I did in my original population. That's the founder effect. So I'm still going from large to small. I lose genetic variety or genetic diversity, but it's because I'm colonizing a new area. Bottleneck effect is happening in the same area, but there's a loss of population due to an event. All right, now switching gears, we also have gene flow. Now, gene flow is a good thing, okay? And gene flow is good because I have organisms moving between 2 populations. And so if I move between 2 populations, that's actually going to increase genetic diversity. Because if I look at that first population, population A, I have yellow and blue and green variation within my population. And if I look at my B, well, B has red and blue and yellow. But as B travels to A, maybe they'll start introducing some of that red variation with it. And then as my population moves to A, I'm going to introduce some of the green. And so that's just increasing genetic variation within a population. So gene flow is a very, very good thing. Okay? Now, next idea, we also have sexual selection. Sexual selection means that you have a trait that an organism, that gives an organism advantage when they're competing for mates. And so if you look at these two are my cardinals. Well, if we're talking about a boy cardinal, right? Boy cardinals are always bright red, right? Like him. And so if I'm a girl cardinal and I see this guy right here on the left and I see this guy here on the right, I'm going to want to mate with this boy on the right because he is a brighter color. And if he is a brighter color, if he's a brighter color, then he must be more fit than the duller bird, right? And so by me selecting the brighter color, that's sexual selection. And when we talk about sexual dimorphism is when your organisms are phenotypically different between the sexes, all right? So if you think of the cardinals, right? The girls are we can say this is a girl now, we can say the girls are really dull red and the boys are really bright red. So those are two different phenotypes. They show sexual dimorphism. All right, next idea is reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation means I don't get any more gene exchange between a population. And this is where speciation begins. Don't forget, speciation is when I create a new species. Now, there's a few things that can happen for reproductive isolation. The first one being a pre-zygotic barrier. Remember, pre means before, and zygote is a fertilized egg. So these are barriers that keep a fertilized egg from happening, right? So even if you have two organisms in the same location, they're never going to have sex and have a baby because of these barriers, because of these mechanisms. Now, the first one is temporal. Temporal is referring to time. And if you guys have ever seen cicadas, right, we have two varieties in our area. We have the 13-year cicada and the 17-year cicada. That means one comes up out of the ground every 13 years and the other one comes up out of the ground every 17 years. Well, the one that comes up in the year 13 will never have a chance to mate with the ones that come up in the year 17. So even though if they came up at the same time, they could mate, because of this time difference between 13 and 17 years, they're never going to have sex, which means you're never going to get a zygote. So that's a temporal isolation, or a temporal pre-zygotic barrier. Now, mechanical pre-zygotic barriers just means the pieces don't fit. Like, two organisms could try to have sex, but because they're different, the pieces aren't going to fit together, which means you're never going to get a fertilized egg. The next one is behavioral. Behavioral is just when you're, like, say for example, birds do a dance to attract a mate. Well, if you're a different type of bird, then you're not going to find that dance attractive and you won't mate with them. That's a pre-zygotic barrier. So those two birds will never have sex because the other bird doesn't know what that dance means. And then my last one is ecological. Ecological just means different places. So I could have a bunny over here in Missouri, right? And then I could also have a bunny over here in Washington State, because they're in different locations. They're never going to meet, which means they're never going to have a fertilized egg. So those are pre-zygotic barriers. A post-zygotic barrier is when your organisms have sex, but after they have sex, that offspring has some issues, and normally that comes back down to diploid number, because organisms have a different diploid number than if they do mate with somebody else and get a fertilized offspring. That offspring isn't going to be okay because of the chromosome number differences. So the first one would be reduced hybrid vitality. That means I either have too many or too few genes. And if you remember from karyotyping, if I have too many or too few, my organism isn't going to work correctly. And normally, when he doesn't work correctly, that's gonna also cause sterility. So when my organism has hybrid vitality with too many or too few genes, that will cause fertility issues, which will make that offspring sterile. Then I also have hybrid breakdown. So if I do have a hybrid, they are usually less fit and they won't live long in the environment. Okay, last idea. We have speciation. Remember, speciation is to create a new species. The first kind of speciation is allopatric. That means a physical barrier. So if you look in this first population, they were all blue. Then a barrier came, like let's say a mountain range or a river formed. And you have the blue guys over here, and then you have blue, and maybe there was a mutation for a green gene, but the green gene was advantageous on this side of the mountain, and so these guys stayed blue, and then these guys ended up turning more green, and so now you have a new species. Or you can have sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is there's no physical barrier, but another isolating mechanism, so you don't get gene flow. What this was you have trees and it's shady over here, and then you have sunlight over here. These are lizards. The lizards with the yellow neck are easier to see under the trees because it's darker and the yellow stands out. The lizards with the red neck are easier to see in the sunlight because that stands out. And so even though they were both part of a population at some point, because of this isolating mechanism, that means these lizards would only have sex with other yellow lizards, and then these red lizards would only have sex with other red lizards. And if they do that for long enough, that will cause a speciation event. And then you also have parapatric speciation. Parapatric speciation is where two populations create a hybrid, and that's usually less fit. And so if you look, here is one population, here is another population, where those would meet in the middle, where, purple, so I have blue and I have red, where they meet in the middle here, that's the hybrid, then they would maybe create their own species. And if I have coevolution, two organisms evolve together. So if this were a flower, the nectar's at the bottom. If this is a moth, then his tongue has to be long enough to get to the bottom. Well, if my flower grows longer, then my moth is going to evolve with it and grow a longer tongue. Okay, so these are all mechanisms that also play a role in natural selection. Drift is bad because I lose gene flow. Gene flow is good because it opens up genetic diversity. I have sexual selection. There's a number of things that keep organisms from having sex or having viable offspring. And then I also have speciation events. Okay, hope that helps.